All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we are going to untangle what is arguably one of modern history's absolute most complex and honestly defining geopolitical relationships. We are going to examine exactly how Iran and the United States went from being really close allies to bitter, deeply entrenched rivals. It's this wild, multi-layered story of power, massive resources, and revolution, and we're going to break the whole thing down step by step. Section 1. The Tragic Turning Point. July 3rd, 1988. A commercial passenger plane takes off from Tehran, heading for Dubai. But just 7 minutes into the flight, while flying over the Persian Gulf, the plane is struck. Two missiles, launched from an American warship, the USS Vincennes, hit the aircraft, and it literally disintegrates in midair. All 290 people on board lost their lives that day, and that included 66 children. Obviously, this was a massive, unthinkable tragedy and a stark violation of human rights. But the biggest question we have to ask here is simply why? How on earth did these two nations get to a point where a US warship is firing on a commercial Iranian flight? Well, the contrast is just staggering. I mean, decades ago, the United States was actually sending billions of dollars in aid to Iran to help with its security. And get this, especially given today's headlines, the US actually supplied Iran with a 5-megawatt reactor and 5 kilograms of 93% pure uranium. Literally, the US helped jumpstart their nuclear program. Now, compare that to the modern reality. Decades of crippling economic sanctions, military strikes, and this intense underlying nuclear paranoia. It's like night and day. So how did these two nations get here? How does a relationship flip so drastically from, freely providing nuclear materials to imposing totally devastating sanctions? Well, to understand that, we really have to trace the domino effect backward through history. Okay, so here's our roadmap. We just covered the tragic turning point. Next up, we'll look at tobacco, oil, and rebellion, followed by the 1953 CIA coup. Then we'll dive into modernization versus tradition, the 1979 Islamic Revolution, and finally wrap up with a legacy of sanctions. Section 2. Tobacco, oil, and rebellion. So this all kicks off back in 1890. At the time, Iran was ruled by Nasir al-Din Shah. Now, tobacco was a massive domestic industry. We're talking about employing over 200,000 people. But the Shah goes and makes this secret deal granting a 50-year monopoly on all tobacco sales to a British merchant. As you can imagine, the Iranian public was absolutely furious. And this is when the top religious leader Ayatollah Mirza Shirazi steps in. In 1891, he issues a fatwa against tobacco. The resulting protest was so overwhelmingly powerful that the Shah was literally forced to cancel the contract. And this is a super vital piece of the puzzle, right? Because it proved that the religious leaders, the Ayatollahs, held immense power over the public, sometimes even more than the king, especially when it came to pushing back against foreign interference. Fast forward past the Shah's assassination, and in 1909, the British discover massive oil reserves in Iran, which shifted the whole focus to a much more lucrative resource. And honestly, this brilliantly illustrates the tension that followed. Look at the Anglo-Persian Oil Company deal. Iran was receiving a mere 16% of the profits from their very own oil, while a massive 84% went straight to the British. To put that into perspective, the Iranian public had to sit there and watch foreign businessmen grow incredibly wealthy off Iranian resources while their own countries struggled economically. Section 3. The 1953 CIA coup. Okay, so between 1951 and 1953, things escalate rapidly. A highly popular prime minister named Mohammad Mossadegh comes to power and does the unthinkable. He officially nationalizes Iranian oil, effectively kicking out the British and the Americans. Well, the US and Britain immediately retaliate with severe economic sanctions. And then that economic pressure turns into covert action. In 1953, the CIA and British MI6 literally orchestrate a coup. They overthrow the democratically elected Mossadegh and restore absolute power to the monarch, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the Shah of Iran. And this right here, the 1953 coup, this was the exact moment many Iranians really began to see America as an enemy of their democracy. Because before this, the US wasn't actually heavily involved in Iran's colonial exploitation. That was mostly the British and the Russians. But by actively overthrowing Mossadegh just to keep the oil flowing and the Shah in power, the United States fundamentally shifted how the Iranian public perceived them. Overnight, they went from being this sort of distant friend to a very direct threat. Section 4. Modernization versus tradition. Now, what's really interesting about this next phase is the massive contrast happening inside the country. The Shah launches what he called the White Revolution, which was this push for aggressive Western modernization. Women gained the right to vote, the legal marriage age for girls was raised, and the student population just exploded, jumping from 1.5 million to 10 million. On paper, it looks like massive progress. But beneath the surface, there was a much darker reality. The Shah used a brutal secret police force known as Savak to literally disappear political dissidents. On top of that, he banned Islamic calendars and largely ignored the country's deep Sharia traditions, which aggressively alienated Iran's conservative Islamic roots. So you have this massive cultural divide, and it creates a huge opening for the opposition. Enter an exiled religious leader, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. He begins speaking out against the Shah, and he absolutely did not hold back. He called the Shah a messenger of the devil and famously labeled America the Great Satan. And the wild part is, even from exile, Khomeini was incredibly effective. He would record his fiery anti-Western messages on cassette tapes. Those tapes were then smuggled into Iran and copied and distributed everywhere. It was like a 1970s version of going viral. His charismatic message about returning to Islamic values offered this beacon of hope to people who felt completely crushed by the Shah's regime. Section 5. The 1979 Islamic Revolution. 377. In August 1978, a mysterious fire broke out at the Cinema Rex in Abadan, Iran. The doors were locked from the outside, and 377 people tragically burned to death. Now, while the exact perpetrators remain a subject of historical debate, Ayatollah Khomeini immediately pointed the finger at the Shah and his agents. This devastating event basically acted as the primary match in the powder keg of revolution. The Iranian people, who were already pushed to the absolute brink, just poured into the streets in the millions. And from there, events just snowballed incredibly fast. Starting with that Cinema Rex fire in August 1978, the mass protests became totally uncontrollable. By early 1979, the Shah, who actually was suffering from cancer at the time, flees Iran and eventually heads to the US for medical treatment. Then, on February 1st, 1979, Ayatollah Khomeini returns from a 15-year exile to an absolute hero's welcome. He officially transforms the nation from a monarchy into an Islamic government. And then, the breaking point. In November 1979, all that boiling anger towards American interference culminated when Iranian students stormed the US Embassy in Tehran. During the hostage crisis, these students took 52 Americans captive, and they held them for a staggering 444 days. Their core demand was very clear. They wanted the United States to send the deposed Shah back to Iran to stand trial for what his regime had done. But the United States absolutely refused. And this bitter, very public standoff, it was the final nail in the coffin. It officially killed the historical alliance once and for all. Section 6. A legacy of sanctions. So, following the revolution, the relationship basically devolves into a locked Cold War. In 1983, Iranian-backed Hezbollah attacked the US Embassy and Marine barracks in Lebanon, which killed hundreds of Americans. Then in 1988, we have that tragic US shootdown of the Iranian passenger plane that we talked about at the very beginning of this explainer. And from 1995 right up to the present day, we see an era defined by endless, crippling economic sanctions imposed by the US. The goal there has always been to check Iran's regional influence and their pursuit of nuclear weapons, which, ironically, is the exact same nuclear technology the US actually helped initiate back during the era of the Shah. It's just this continuous, tragic cycle of proxy conflicts and deep, deep suspicion. So we've traced this entire timeline, from a super close partnership all the way to a deeply entrenched rivalry. It really makes you wonder how differently history might have unfolded. I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to chew on. Was the fall of the Shah inevitable, given those deep cultural divides within Iran? Or did heavy-handed foreign interference actually force the whole thing to happen? Weigh the history we just explored, and definitely let us know your perspective down in the comments. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep learning.